There are a lot of myths and legends surrounding the sinking of the Titanic. This one, well, it's a doozy. Did the White Star Line ever actually call their ship unsinkable? Well, the truth is, it's kind of complicated. Unsinkable is a word that can mean only one thing. It's an absolute. But it's been applied a few times in history to things that absolutely could sink. Today, the word is still largely attached to one disaster in particular, one that shocked the public so severely that debate still rages about it to this day: Titanic. How that word came to be associated with the Titanic is an interesting story. There was a whole series of disasters and accidents that had to happen to ships before Titanic that her design team had learned lessons from and tried to implement into their own ship's designs. But was Titanic ever actually marketed as unsinkable? Who even used the word, and why, if ever, did people think the ship couldn't actually sink? Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and today, let's bust some more Titanic myths. It's almost impossible to bring up Titanic in discussion without the word unsinkable eventually popping up. After all, she was considered an engineering marvel of her time. With so many technologically advanced safety components, she was thought to be virtually invincible. That's why, of course, the news of her loss was met with disbelief, shock, and actual palpable outrage by the general public. But it may surprise you to know that the word unsinkable had been used many times before for other ships, and that Titanic's designers and builders had actually put a lot of thought into learning from other disasters to try to properly earn the phrase. First, let's try to understand where the word actually came from and how it came to be associated with Titanic in particular. The first thing we need to consider is that monumental leap forward from the older means of travel to the ocean liners like Titanic. We've talked about it a lot on this channel. It was like a space-age jump. In the 1850s, people were still sailing for months at a time on tiny sailing ships of about 3,000 tons. But just 50 years later, a 20,000-ton passenger steamship could cross the Atlantic in just 5 days. It was an extraordinary time, and rules and regulations were, in some ways, struggling to keep up. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, at the height of what's widely considered the golden age of ocean liners, competition was fierce amongst rival shipping companies who were vying to offer the most extraordinary passenger travel experience available. Transatlantic crossings aboard massive passenger ships were becoming not only a comfortable means of travel, but a status symbol among society's elite. By building the most luxurious and talked about liners at sea, a shipping company could cement their standing as the go-to choice for affluent travellers. Cunard and White Star, Britain's main two transatlantic lines, were the main opponents entrenched in this war. The European companies like North German Lloyd, Hamburg America, and France's CGT, or French Line, were also involved. It was a dizzying race. When one company would successfully build and launch what was considered the grandest liner ever built by man, another company would respond quickly with a bigger, faster, and more luxurious liner and reclaim the spotlight. This happened on and on and on for decades leading up to Titanic's launch. The wealthiest members of society would tend to travel in cliques, little groups, and they'd only sail on the best of the best, meaning that if a company could win over one notable public figure, they'd likely win over their friends, family, and colleagues as well. It was a classic capitalist neck-and-neck contest to secure the loyalty and cash of some of the most influential people alive. Most people think that profits for the big shipping companies were driven only by the migrant trade, but actually, it was the wealthier travellers in first class who brought in the most revenue. By 1908, Cunard Line had recently launched sister ships Mauretania and Lusitania, which at the time were some of the fastest and most lavish passenger liners ever built. Both liners had snagged the highly coveted blue ribbon for the fastest transatlantic crossing, an honour that further drove wealthy clientele toward one liner over another. Mauretania would end up holding onto this record for an astounding 19 years. And this is where we learn the first very interesting fact about the word unsinkable, because Titanic wasn't even the first ship to ever have the word attached to it. Long before the term had been tossed around for Titanic and Olympic's construction, it had actually been used by a trade journal called The Shipbuilder in 1907 when they were discussing Cunard Line's Mauretania and Lusitania, calling them, quote, practically unsinkable. And it heralded their modern and cutting-edge safety innovations. It wasn't just the Cunarders either. The term unsinkable was applied to German liners like the Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse. By highlighting how safe their ships were, in their marketing, shipping companies like the White Star Line hoped to soothe the fears of a still nervous public. But these companies were also very clever with how they worded those claims. For centuries, just setting out to sea to travel somewhere was a serious risk to your own life. The White Star Line and Cunard had both lost ships in disasters. In the early days, ships had been driven onto rocks, lost in storms with hundreds of lives lost or simply disappeared. Even before then, in the golden days of sail, whole ships would never be seen again. On the passenger trade to Australia in the early 1800s, many would simply vanish in the vicinity of icebergs drifting up from Antarctica. The Lock Line, for example, operated a whole fleet of 25 smart, modern sailing ships out to Australia, but only 5 would ever be scrapped because the majority of the rest were lost in accidents, groundings, storms, or disappearances. This is the kind of environment Titanic was born out of. For the longest time, people were afraid of the ocean, and they had good reason to be so. Seas could generate waves the size of mountains, ships could be swallowed whole and never seen again. Before Titanic's sinking gripped the world's imagination, horrible stories like the loss of the SS Birkenhead in the Arctic ran in the papers and they terrified readers. This is also the environment that Titanic's owners operated in, and even some of her crew, like Titanic's captain, Edward John Smith, were veterans of the days of sail. In fact, Smith had seen and heard it all. The sea was a very scary place. In fact, Captain Smith had started out on sailing ships of maybe 1,000 or 2,000 tons, but by 1907, he was in command of White Star Line's newest ship, the enormous 20,000-ton liner Adriatic. He said with complete sincerity in an interview that, quote, "I cannot imagine any condition which would cause a ship to founder. I cannot conceive of any vital disaster happening to this vessel. Modern shipbuilding has gone beyond that." This was 5 years before the introduction of Titanic, and already in the press, this new breed of ship was being touted as impervious to disaster and Mother Nature. 4 years later, Smith would be in command of Olympic, more than twice the size of the Adriatic. So, what kinds of disasters and accidents had guided the design and construction of Titanic? Well, we've all heard about the so-called watertight bulkheads and doors, the deficiency of lifeboats, guided by the idea that the ship itself was a lifeboat. There are dozens of disasters that had guided the designs of ships like Titanic. But then in 1909, just 3 years prior to the sinking of the ship, another ship sank which seemed to prove that the new designs worked. The White Star Liner, RMS Republic, known as the Millionaire's ship due to the number of affluent who were fond of travelling aboard her, was making a crossing from New York to the Mediterranean when she encountered some heavy fog off the island of Nantucket. Realising the very real threat of the poor weather conditions and extremely limited visibility, Republic maintained her speed and regularly signalled her presence to any nearby ships using her whistles. But suddenly, at around 5:45 AM, another ship's whistle was heard by the crew, and it sounded ominously close. The Italian liner, the SS Florida, appeared out of the fog, colliding with the Republic midships on her port side, flooding the engine and boiler rooms, and crushing Florida's bow. Fortunately for the passengers, the sinking of the Republic was a very slow process, taking nearly 9 hours to fully founder, and it was all thanks to all the lessons learned and the design choices that had been made. The watertight bulkheads, the huge interior steel walls which could be sealed off, prevented water from quickly spreading throughout the ship. Crucially though, the state-of-the-art Marconi wireless system that was found on board Republic was used to send one of history's first ever distress signals to call for assistance. By the time the ship went under, all its passengers had been successfully transferred to other ships aboard the Republic's own lifeboats. It was believed that with the amount of maritime traffic ever increasing, even in the deadliest of situations, another ship would always be nearby to receive a distress call like this and rescue all the passengers on board. Miraculously, the only deaths attributed to this accident were 6 people who perished as a result of the collision itself, rather than the sinking. The loss of the Republic represented a new, safer era in sea travel, which was bolstered by technological advancements that made peril at sea seemingly a thing of the past. Even if a ship did sink, thanks to new safety measures, the ship's lifeboats would only ever need to be used to transfer survivors from one ship to another. The concept was proved, and the lessons were learned and ingrained. So, just how could you really blame the shipping industry and the public at large for getting swept up in this excitement as ships only got bigger and bigger? Of course, size wasn't just a matter of marketing and good hubris. A bigger ship was more stable. It was less at risk of being swallowed whole by the ocean or damaged by some massive wave. it would take longer to sink, it was simply safer. With modern ships getting bigger and safer all the time, it makes sense that words like unsinkable would get thrown around, especially when Olympic and Titanic, which were 3 times larger and far more advanced than Republic, were being constructed. Now look, as we know, the advancements in ship design and safety by this point had come a long way since the days of sail. It was thought at the time that features like watertight compartments would render any vessel equipped with them virtually impervious to hazards like grounding, rough weather, or collisions at sea. The watertight compartments on Titanic were designed to run the entire width of the lower portion of the ship, breaking it up into 16 sections, each of which could be individually sealed off via special watertight doors through an electric switch in the bridge in the event of flooding or a breach. By doing so, incoming water would be contained within just those compartments without flooding the entire ship, allowing her to stay afloat even with damage to the hull. This was considered cutting edge at the time. In the years prior, any breach in a ship's hull would result in a sinking. With this new and advanced technology, passengers no longer needed to fear the ship foundering thanks to taking on water or running aground. It was this safety measure in particular that earned Titanic and her contemporaries the title, practically unsinkable. In reality though, there are virtually no records of a ship being advertised as just unsinkable, that is not without a qualifier. This brings us to the marketing and word-of-mouth advertising used behind ships like Titanic. It was easy enough to relay the safety of your ship to a restless clientele, but the White Star Line took no chances when it came to making actual, legitimate promises on paper. In fact, in almost all printed marketing relating to Titanic or any passenger liners of the day, the ships weren't even referred to as unsinkable. Really, the word was not even used on any postcards or posters by the ship's owners. But in Titanic's case, the word was used, at least once, in a September 1910 publicity brochure advertising the construction of Titanic and Olympic. The company stated, and pay attention to the wording here, that, quote, "As far as it is possible to do so, these 2 wonderful vessels are designed to be unsinkable." By the standards of the day, and as well as they were able to, Harland and Wolff, the shipbuilders, had made Olympic and Titanic as unsinkable as conventional wisdom and experience had taught them. By including the phrase, "as far as it is possible to do so," the brochure's wording was insinuating that it was actually impossible to build a ship that could never sink. While this may seem like a technicality or a small semantic difference, it's that exact tightrope walk that kept companies like the White Star Line and Harland and Wolff in the clear legally, while still maintaining an air of dominance when it came to the safety of their ships. The Shipbuilder, which is the publication largely responsible for liners being ever thought of as unsinkable in print, may not have been so original in their reporting as you might think. According to maritime historian Bill Sauter, much of the writing found within the pages of the Shipbuilder had likely been supplied by White Star Line directly, with very few changes made to the copy between the shipping journal's articles and White Star's own publicity brochures. The common idea of Titanic being touted as unsinkable by dozens of independent papers, journals, and brochures before the sinking seems to diminish in gravity when you consider that the origin of many of these claims can be traced back to one not so impartial source. In all likelihood, White Star Line realised fully that the use of the term unsinkable would catch on and word would spread among the potential clientele, with the qualifier practically, or as far as it is possible to do so, ending up completely forgotten. And it seems to have worked. Word of mouth was a powerful tool for this type of advertising, and it was especially effective in the booking process. This was 1912, of course, an era well before the advent of the internet and travel booking websites. In order to book a passage on a ship, you would need to actually speak to a travel agent in their offices to help facilitate your plans. Arriving at the travel agency, and undoubtedly brimming with questions, potential passengers were reassured by White Star agents that yes, of course the Titanic was unsinkable. Sure enough, these claims of unsinkability spread and were beginning to seep into the mythos surrounding the ship even before she left Southampton. There are many examples and testimonies that actually support this. Take, for example, one of the most notable passengers aboard Titanic, the British fashion designer Lady Duff Gordon. She found herself in need of quick travel accommodations thanks to sudden and urgent business in New York. Upon arriving at the White Star offices in Liverpool and meeting with a clerk, she was told that due to short notice, they would only be able to accommodate her on the maiden voyage of the brand new ship Titanic. Though she had made the transatlantic crossing several times before, Lady Duff Gordon was nervous at the prospect of sailing on a new and unfamiliar ship. According to her, the clerk scoffed at her hesitance and said, "Of all things, I should imagine you could not possibly feel nervous on the Titanic. Why, the boat is absolutely unsinkable. Her watertight compartments would enable her to weather the fiercest sea ever known, and she is the last word in comfort and luxury." Then, maybe as a final selling point to sway Lady Duff Gordon, the clerk added, "This first voyage is going to make history in ocean travel." Unfortunately, he was right, just not in the way that he probably expected. Claims about Olympic and Titanic's unsinkability can even be traced to some of her officers and designers. One man recalled in a newspaper report from 1912 that Captain Smith had used the word unsinkable to describe his ship after a collision with the British warship Hawke. Apparently, Smith had said, "The Olympic is unsinkable, and Titanic will be the same when she's put in commission." Why, either of these vessels could be cut in halves and each would remain afloat almost indefinitely. The non-sinkable vessel has been reached in these two wonderful craft. I venture to add that even if the engines and boilers of these vessels were to fall through their bottoms, the vessels would remain afloat. Smith's description of being able to cut or damage Titanic into sections and those sections staying afloat is corroborated by 3 separate witnesses on 3 separate occasions. And we don't need to wonder very much where he got that specific turn of phrase from either. Eleanor Casimir was a first-class passenger who remembered that Thomas Andrews, Titanic's chief designer, had told her the same thing over the dinner table. White Star Line and Harland and Wolff might have avoided heavy use of the word unsinkable in their published brochures and their material, but it seems like the ship's design team and their crew weren't afraid of spreading the word, and it worked. There are dozens of examples of witnesses and survivors recalling the word unsinkable being used and spread between friends and officials alike. Unfortunately, the spread of such claims had taken hold of many aboard once the ship set sail, to the extent that even once the ship was actively sinking, many passengers and even some of the crew still didn't even call into question the integrity of the ship. Most assumed that even though she was compromised, listing, and visibly going down by the head, she would still manage to stay afloat until rescue arrived, just like the Republic had. Passengers were told to put on their life belts, but many considered the process needless aboard a ship that they believed to be unsinkable. Even once women and children were beginning to be ushered into the lifeboats, many hesitated to board them. But, beneath their feet, the same 2 men who'd told them that the ship could be cut into 3 sections and stay afloat, Thomas Andrews and Captain Smith, were stood staring at tons and tons of water pouring in and calculating just how much time was left. What would be the point of stepping into a cramped, rickety lifeboat, leaving behind husbands and fathers, being lowered into the freezing cold ocean in pitch black, when instead they could just stay aboard Titanic and wait for transfer onto another ship once it arrived? The belief in Titanic's unsinkability was responsible for a great deal of delay in the actual loading of the lifeboats, since even some officers aboard didn't really believe the reality of the sinking until time was already running out. This contributed to several lifeboats launching well under capacity, some by a factor of more than half, even though the ship already didn't have enough lifeboats for all on board. Even after she had sunk on the morning of April 15th, 1912, she was still being lauded to the press as unsinkable. Philip A.S. Franklin, White Star Line's boss in New York, was speaking to the press regarding reports the Titanic had struck an iceberg overnight. There had still been no confirmation of her sinking by that point, and Franklin was determined to dispel any rumours that his ship had gone down. He made a few different statements to different publications, assuring them and their readers that there was no danger of the iceberg having caused the ship to sink. He repeated again and again his conviction that no fatal damage had befallen Titanic, emphasising that even if the ship had gone down several feet by the head, it wouldn't interfere with her successfully completing her maiden voyage. Later that day, though, as news began to spread that yes, the unsinkable Titanic had in fact sunk, Franklin made one final statement to the press. With tears in his eyes, he is quoted as saying, "I thought her unsinkable, and I based my opinion on the best expert advice. I do not understand it." So much faith had been put into the design of Titanic's watertight bulkheads, doors, and compartments. In theory, the idea seemed sound enough, but today we all know where the failure points were. The bulkheads didn't reach any higher than E-deck, only a story or two above the waterline. Water could spill over the top of them and have its run of the ship. The bulkheads had slowed the rate of sinking down, to be sure, but if they'd reached higher up in the hull, then it's likely Titanic could have remained afloat into the next morning and the next day. Remarkably, the story doesn't actually end there. After Titanic was sunk, her sister Olympic was pulled from service for a full refurbishment. Her safety features were enhanced, of course. A full inner hull was installed, her watertight bulkheads were raised higher up in the hull, with many reaching as high as B-deck. She was laden with dozens and dozens of lifeboats, and when she was revealed to the world, she was referred to in marketing as the new Olympic. The New York Times reported, the White Star Liner Olympic left Southampton today on her first trip for New York since she was fitted with double steel bottom and additional bulkheads that are declared by her owners to make her unsinkable. Around May 1912, Bruce Ismay, the man who dreamt up Olympic and Titanic, made a statement in an interview, and it was poignant because Ismay was deeply affected by the loss of his ship, and he'd never actually be the same again. He said, "Everybody learns by experience. One thing that I learned when the Titanic went down is that the laws relating to the preservation of life are not adequate. They were based, no doubt, on the assumption that the great ocean liners, with their highly developed system of bulkheads, were unsinkable. But experience has taught us that at present there is no such thing as an unsinkable ship. I admit that I was among those who were deluded on this point. I had gone along like the rest of the steamship men on the theory that our ships were unsinkable." So, was the Titanic ever actually called unsinkable? Well, kind of, yeah. Not in a really concrete way, as if posters for the ship had just said unsinkable right on them, but in a more roundabout way, through word of mouth, and sometimes, as in Harland and Wolff's brochure, with that qualifier. As always, history is nuanced, so the next time somebody brings this topic up as a did you know fact, you can hit them with the old, well actually. That's what this channel is all about. Join me next time when we deconstruct some more Titanic myths. 1. Was the ship on fire when she struck the iceberg and therefore weakened because of it? And 2. Was she made out of brittle and poor steel? Let's find out. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. And as always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.